What's up guys, my name is James Blissett, professional sports bettor and founder of Lucrative MMA, which is my handicapping service where I help people make money from betting on MMA. And in this video, I'm going to talk to you about why watching interviews when you're betting on MMA is usually a bad idea and why it will usually end up with you losing your money. So a lot of people bet on MMA, a lot of people bet on sports, but not many people do it professionally, right? And there's been many times in my life where my only income has been from sports betting. And there's been a lot of times in my life where I've realized that my process for sports betting has been wrong. My process for sports betting has also changed as I get older and older, and as the years pass on. You have to constantly adapt to change within the sports betting markets as well. And one of the things I've learned is that when you're betting on sports, specifically MMA, and you're listening to fighter interviews as part of your research for the upcoming fights, it can often lead you astray. And if you listen to these fight interviews a lot, it can often lead you down a wrong path. And you end up betting money on spots you probably wouldn't bet if you hadn't listened to those interviews. And more often than not, the interviews will actually lead you down the wrong path and get you to bet emotionally, which is one of the #1 sins in sports betting. You do not want to be emotional with your money. If you find yourself listening to these fighter interviews and betting money on these fighters, dependent on what you hear in the interview, you will end up losing more money than you earn from it. So I'll explain that a little bit more and I'll explain exactly what I'm talking about, right? So there's many different ways to cap a fight when we're talking about who we're gonna bet on in the upcoming fights this weekend, right? There's many different ways of doing it. A lot of people use stats to cap a fight. A lot of people use tape study to cap a fight. A lot of people just go on their memory. And these people usually, they don't bet professionally, they're just betting for fun, right? But they just go on their memory, they maybe watch some interviews, they watch some promos, and then they make their bets. Now, I'm not going to say any one way is right or any one way is wrong. But what I can say in my personal experience betting on MMA for a long time is that there's certain ways that usually end up being more profitable than others. One of the worst things you can do when you're betting on MMA is listen to fighter interviews before they're fighting. So very often, if we have a fight week coming up, the interviews for those fighters fighting that week will start popping up on YouTube. They'll start popping up on podcasts. They'll start popping up on Instagram, on Twitter, on Spotify, all of this stuff, right? If a fighter is fighting on the weekend, he's going to be doing a lot of interviews that week, right? If you listen to those interviews, you are going to be led astray, led down a wrong path. Because these fighters, they will say many things that do not come to fruition in the fight. So these fighters will have a fight coming up on Saturday, for example, and it'll be Monday, Tuesday, and they'll start doing interviews. They will do interviews and talk about that upcoming matchup on the weekend. And they will very often do the exact opposite of what they said they're going to do in the interview. I want to give you a few specific examples of this, right? So you understand exactly what I'm talking about. The first example I want to give you is Darius. Now, shout out to Darius because he's one of my favorite fighters in UFC. One of the main reasons for that is because he's won me the most money in UFC history of almost any fighter, right? Now, I haven't actually gone back and sat down and looked at who has been my most profitable fighter, but I basically know off the top of my head that Darius is at least in the top 5 fighters that have made me the most money. I've bet on Darius in virtually every single one of his UFC fights, and he's won almost every single one of them, right? He's won most of them, especially in the recent run over the last 5 or 6 years. So I already know he's earned me a lot of money. I had a huge bet on Darius, and this is the example I'm going to talk about now. I had a massive bet on Darius over Tony Ferguson when they fought about 2 years ago, right? And I listened to a couple of his interviews going into that fight. Now, I am telling you to almost ignore interviews, and I'll basically do a recap at the end of this video and break down whether you should be listening to interviews, how many times you should be listening to interviews, how often you should be listening to them, and if you should take them into account in your betting process at all, right? I'll say that at the end. But for now, when I was listening to his interviews going into that Tony Ferguson fight, I had the same opinion as I do now. Even this was like 2-3 years ago. I still, even 2-3 years ago, didn't really take much notice of interviews. But I still listen to them, and I still listen to them today. It's rare, I don't do it often, but I still do it. So I found myself listening to a few Darius interviews, and I believe this was after I placed a big bet on him, right? So I put lots of money on him on multiple different sports books, and my position was locked in, right? So I started listening to a few of his interviews coming up to that Tony Ferguson fight. And when I was doing tape research before I listened to the interviews, the reason I bet on Darius was because I thought he would have a massive edge in the grappling. And I thought that if Tony Ferguson ever started to put any type of pressure on Beneil Darius in the striking, Darius could instantly go to the wrestling, get Tony Ferguson down, and clearly win the round, easily win the round, win a decision by laying on top of him for 15 minutes, or potentially even finish him from top position, right? So this is a big reason why I bet on Beneil Darius, and it was the only reason why I put so much money on Beneil Darius, because I was so confident that he would be able to take Tony Ferguson down, wet blanket him, and make it a boring fight that he could easily dominate from top position in the grappling. I thought he could hold his own in the striking, and to be honest, actually favored him in the striking as well. But you could say that I was hoping it would be a boring fight and that Beneil Darius would take the path of least resistance and just take Tony Ferguson down. So it comes to the interviews now. So I found myself watching some Beneil Darius interviews before that fight, and obviously I was hoping he would go into the interview. I wasn't expecting anything really, but what I wanted to hear him say was that, yes, I'm going to go to my wrestling, I'm going to take Tony down, I know he doesn't have good grappling defense, or I know he doesn't have good takedown defense, I'm a good wrestler, I'm going to take him down, I'm going to win the fight cleanly, right? That's what I was hoping for in the back of my mind when I'm listening to this interview. What he said shocked me. He said that, okay, I know Tony Ferguson's supposed to be the most crazy fighter in the UFC, but I'm going to show him that he's actually wrong and that I'm the most crazy fighter in the UFC. So I know I told you that when I listen to interviews, I don't really take much from them. I don't really believe the fighters that much. But I'll be lying if I didn't say that I shit my pants in this when I heard this interview, right? Beneil Darius has just said that he's going to out crazy Tony Ferguson. That doesn't mean he's going to take him down and wrestle to a boring decision. That means he's going to go insane, spinning back fist, put himself in danger, and put himself in a position to probably be finished, right? Potentially be finished. So I was shitting my pants. Now, I understood, though, that most of the time, or a lot of the time, you hear these fighters say one thing and they do something else. But that still didn't stop me from being extremely scared from this specific matchup, right? So the fight comes along, and lo and behold, he doesn't out crazy Tony Ferguson. He doesn't engage in any sort of dangerous striking, dangerous grappling. He takes Tony Ferguson down multiple times in the fight, cleanly wins the fight. It was basically a boring fight, really, because he just takes him down, wet blankets him for 15 minutes, did lock in a knee bar at one point. Tony Ferguson, absolute animal, didn't tap. But it was a boring fight. He did the complete opposite of what he said on tape. Right, so I watched that interview and I was extremely scared after watching that interview. Even though I know that interviews are not really to be listened to, not really to be respected in the betting game, I basically ended up being scared for 3 or 4 days after I watched the interview for no reason, because he did exactly what I thought he was going to do before I watched the interview. But I want to talk about a situation that may have been a little bit different if I hadn't placed a bet on Beneil Darius and I watched that interview. So if I hadn't already placed a bet on Darius, I was thinking about placing a bet on Darius, but then I watched that interview and I heard him say he's going to out crazy Tony Ferguson. I may not have bet Darius, or I may have bet him, but I may not have bet him for so much money. I may not have put a really big amount of money on him, because I would have been scared that he was going to out crazy Tony Ferguson, even though he doesn't show that on his tape. Now, as I said, he is a wild man on tape. He can be wild, but he's very smart and he will go to the grappling if he has a big edge there. He's done it in his entire career. He gets takedowns on everybody that he has an edge in the grappling on, right? So watching that interview, it could have swayed me off. Now, it probably wouldn't have swayed me off personally, because as I said, I don't really listen to fight interviews, but a lot of people out there do, and you may do that, and that's who I'm making the video for, right? You have to be careful when you're listening to these fighter interviews, because you may have been like me and you may have been scared off Beneil Darius's money line, or you may have cashed out your position on Beneil Darius's money line because maybe you respect fighter interviews more than you necessarily should. It's funny because if you're watching an interview and a fighter's fighting in 3 days and then they say, yeah, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do that, I'm gonna go out there and get a first round knockout, I'm gonna go out there and start extremely fast. I know I drop the early minutes usually, or I drop the first round, so I can't drop the first round this time, I'm gonna go crazy. You're gonna listen to that and you're gonna believe them. Fighters have a lot of self-belief, and fighters can be very persuasive when they're speaking, right? Because they have a lot of self-belief. Anyone with a lot of self-belief is persuasive when you're listening to them. You have to have self-belief to be a fighter, so naturally they're gonna be persuasive. You're gonna listen to their interview and you're gonna be like, he's talking some sense here, she's talking some sense here. Maybe I am gonna change my betting position, or maybe I'm gonna change my prediction, the way I was gonna bet the fight, whatever it may be. So you have to be very careful, because when a fight actually happens, instincts kick in. People don't do what they say they're gonna do. In their head, they want to start fast. In their head, Darius wants to be known as more crazy than Tony Ferguson. But when kicks are flying at his face, when punches are flying at his face, and he's got his career on the line, his money on the line, he's got a family to feed, he doesn't get a win bonus if he doesn't win, he gets half his paycheck if he loses, then things change very quickly from what they was potentially saying in an interview a week earlier. I want to say another example, right? Many times over the last 6-7 years where I've been listening to MMA fighter interviews, and as I say, I don't really do it that much anymore. I didn't really ever do it too much fight week anyway, because I found out very early that it kind of interrupted my betting process. But obviously I've been betting on MMA for a long time, so I have listened to a lot of MMA interviews. And something else that I've noticed is that fighters will say that usually a fighter will never come out and say they've had a bad training camp, but they will hint that they have had some problems in their training camp. One that comes to mind is when Max Holloway said that he wasn't able to train for the Calvin Kattar fight, he was only able to train over Zoom. Now maybe he was trolling, maybe he wasn't. He consistently said, and still says to this day, that he wasn't trolling and it was serious. But he came out against Calvin Kattar after training on Zoom, is what he said in the fight week interviews. He came out and had probably his #1 performance in his MMA UFC history against Calvin Kattar, right? Another thing is that fighters will say they're recovering from an injury, and they had an injury and they had surgery and now they're recovering from it, but they will look amazing. They'll look like they never had surgery at all. Now, to play devil's advocate here, which is always good when you're trying to break down the best way to do things, right? You should always look at both sides of the coin. So let's look at the other side of the coin. How can it be beneficial to watch interviews? When is it beneficial, right? There's been many times where I've watched interviews and I'll get little nuggets from that interview, right? You will hear that a fighter has been working with a specific sparring partner. The sparring partner might have a very good style that matches their upcoming opponent. If a fighter is fighting a wrestler and you hear in one of his interviews that he's been sparring with a lot of good wrestlers, that's obviously good information to take into your capping. And also, just because of the law of averages, there's going to be many times where you do listen to an interview and a fighter, for example, says, okay, I've been working a lot on my jiu-jitsu, I'm gonna get an armbar this weekend. And the fight comes around and they do get an armbar. You're gonna think you're a genius for listening to an interview and picking them to win via armbar. In reality, you wasn't a genius for picking them to win via armbar. It's just confirmation bias. You forgot the 10 times where you listened to an interview and a fighter said they was going to win by armbar and they didn't. They got choked out themselves, or they won via boring decision. But you don't remember those times. You remember the one time a fighter said he was going to do something and then he did it. It's actually a very uncommon thing for a fighter to pick the way they win a fight. That's why people like Conor McGregor are so captivating, because when he was on his run, he was saying how he was going to knock people out. He was saying the exact round. It doesn't happen very often in fighting, right? But if you listen to interviews, it's going to happen every now and then, right? If you listen to a lot of interviews on a fight week, there's going to be many times where you do hear a fighter say something and that comes to fruition. But there's many more times where they say they're going to do something and they don't. So I guess the bottom line is that you will never be able to tell whether a fighter is A, telling the truth, or whether a fighter is B, predicting the actual outcome of their upcoming fight. Sometimes they will predict it correctly, and sometimes they will say they're going to do something and attempt to do it, but a lot of times they won't. So instead of guessing what times are correct and what times are incorrect, which is almost impossible to do unless you was a psychic, my advice to you is to basically ignore it completely. Think of it as a 50-50. 50% of the time they're talking bullshit and 50% of the time they're telling the truth. But how are you going to differentiate between those two? You don't know. There are certain cases where you can factor in MMA fighter interviews, right? But even when you do factor them in, you should only be letting them affect your betting process by 2, 3, 4%. They should never have a dramatic effect on your betting process. I would never listen to a fighter say something in an interview and let it dramatically affect the way I bet the fight. The only time I would let it have a somewhat significant effect on the way I bet is if the fighter is talking about retirement. but not just mentioning retirement, talking about it heavily, saying, I think this is going to be my last fight, you know, something like this. When you hear this, in my experience, betting on MMA for all these years, it is a red flag. So I will let that affect my betting process somewhat significantly. But even then, I may still bet on them if their odds are correct and if I think it's a good stylistic matchup and stuff like that. So you can still listen to interviews. I am not telling you to not listen to interviews. I am just telling you to be extremely careful when you listen to those interviews on letting those interviews affect the way you bet a fight. Nothing is going to be more beneficial to you than watching tape and making your reads and making your bets based on the tape, based on the stats, based on what the fighter has done in his last 10 fights on tape, not what the fighter said he's going to do this weekend. If you focus on the tape and the tangible evidence that we do have, the things we absolutely do know, as opposed to things that may happen because the fighter has said that it may happen in an interview, you will earn a lot more money from betting on MMA. So thanks for watching the video. Make sure you like this video if you like the content. Give me a comment, subscribe, help grow the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.